and I'll let him take over from here.
Well, thank you, Tanya. I'm excited to be here. It's My name is Shawn Christ. As Tanya mentioned, um, I am a professor and a researcher at the University of Missouri in the States. I've been working with the PKU community, doing research for the past 20 years, which is really making me feel old saying that. I hope you all enjoy my virtual background. I actually looked up the Ganaraska forest, which I believe is where you are. If I may have butchered that, so I apologize. Um, but I feel like I'm there. Hopefully, this is about as close as I can get to being there. I'm excited to be here today to share with you some of the recent research that's being done in our lab as well as other labs across the country to look at the effects of elevated Phe on brain and cognition in individuals with phenylketonuria. Um, what I'll do is I'll go through the talk. Please, if you have paper pencil, you have questions. I want to hear questions. We'll stop at the end to see if anybody has any questions. And in that case, probably Tanya, if somebody has a question and you want to restate it or so I can hear it, that would be fantastic. So we'll go ahead and get started. Well, it works if my mouse works. It's always better. Uh, I always say the best place to start is at the very beginning or at the very basics. And so with that in that spirit, um, what we know is that in individuals without PKU, of course, they ingest typical protein, and part of that protein is an amino acid called phenylalanine. And our body metabolizes or converts that phenylalanine into tyrosine. Um, and tyrosine is what we call a precursor. So tyrosine is going to get us to another place. That tyrosine is further metabolized into neurotransmitters, which include dopamine, which is a very important neurotransmitter for the brain, and other neurotransmitters like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, with what we would call classic PKU or typical PKU, these individuals have a deficiency or an absence of the PAH enzyme that's necessary for the metabolism of phenylalanine into tyrosine. One of the immediate consequences of this is these individuals can have lower than typical levels of tyrosine and thereby lower than typical levels of dopamine. And so within that context, when we think about it, neuropsychology, which is what I do, when we conceptualize and think about PKU, traditionally or historically, if you will, we've thought of PKU, or again, as it's often called PAH deficiency, as again leading to disruptions in the dopamine system. And as I mentioned, dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter for the brain. So if we start dysregulating that system, it can lead to disruption in the brain. Um, and as I kind of alluded to, this has historically, traditionally been really the way we've thought about PKU and the real pathway by which we thought PKU really had its biggest effect on the brain. But the more we study it, the more we realize it's not that simple. It turns out that the biggest impact it appears for that we worry about for individuals with PKU in the brain is really around the elevated Phe levels. And so, with the elevated Phe, once elevations in Phe get into the brain, they can disrupt a number of different processes. Well, one of these, which is what we call myelinization, which involves the white matter, we'll talk about a little bit later. In addition, with the elevated Phe, it's kind of like a double whammy, because what happens is not only once the Phe gets in the brain does it cause havoc, the process by which it gets in the brain also it can be problematic. And what this leads to, as we've heard of, is phenylalanine and other amino acids, so these other proteins, can only get into the brain via one location or kind of transport, or gate is another word. So there's this blood-brain barrier, which is a membrane that surrounds the central nervous system, surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. And these amino acids can only get through in one place, which is called the LAT1 transporter. Again, think of it kind of a gate or a doorway. Well, when you have all this excess phenylalanine, that starts competing with other proteins that are also critically important. So things like we already talked about tyrosine, but also tryptophan. And with that competition, that phenylalanine kind of bullies out the other amino acids. Um, so that they can't get into the brain in the way that they should. So not only does this elevated Phe result in decreased tyrosine, it also results in decreased levels of tryptophan in the brain. Now, the reason I bring up tryptophan is because tryptophan is a precursor for another important neurotransmitter called serotonin. And you may have heard of serotonin. We often think about it in terms of like serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so SSRIs, which are one of the treatments for anxiety and depression. We also know, though, that serotonin is very important in things like cognitive abilities like attention. So with this, what we're learning from some of the mouse and animal models of untreated PKU, where we get really high elevated Phe, is that not only do we have decreased dopamine levels in those animals in the animal models, but it's actually serotonin that's hit even harder. And that's all about this competition at the blood-brain barrier with that excess Phe. So this kind of brings home that we're impacting the brain on several different levels when we have that elevated Phe. Now, of course, when we have these disruptions, that in turn can lead to possibly cognitive and behavioral difficulties in everyday life. What I want to do with our brief time today is I'm going to share with you some of the recent research that we've done particularly on the brain and elevated Phe. And then we'll switch at the end and talk a little bit about what we can potentially see on the impact of cognition and behavior. All right. You know what? I'm going to stop right there just for a moment and see if there's any questions on that, because I just realized I covered a lot. Are there any questions? If not, again, I can take questions at the end, but. All right. Tanya, are we good? All right. I'm going to keep going. If somebody jumps in, please do. So we want to talk about the brain first. Wrong direction. The brain is an incredible organ. It's so complex. There's so many different ways to kind of conceptualize it. But one of the basic distinctions we can make in terms of the brain is between what we call gray matter and what we call white matter. And so to kind of illustrate my point here, I've got on a typical MRI. This is what we call an axial slice. So it's kind of slicing through like a baseball cap. And here at the top of the picture, that's the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. These areas in black here in the middle, they're totally meant to be there. Those are the ventricles. They're full of cerebral spinal fluid. And so this is typical. It's a very typical brain. Now, if we look at a typical brain, the gray matter, which now is highlighted in red, is located primarily on the surface of the brain, or surface of the cortex, so that part that we think of as brain. You can think of the gray matter as the tissue where the data is crunched. That's where the data is processed. If you like computer analogs or analogies, this would be kind of like the CPU, right? So this is the processing unit. That's distinguishable from what we call the white matter. So the white matter is located more medially, so it's more towards the middle, and it represents this highway, if you will, of intricate connections that allow the communication of information or the transfer of information between brain regions, right? So these are, if you will, the wires of the brain connecting everything. Now, when it comes to PKU, again, if we think about historically, the vast majority of the focus in terms of the brain has been on this white matter. And indeed, consistent with that, if we look at the literature suggests, and this is a study, a meta-analysis that was done about 10 years ago, it suggested that greater than 90% of adults with PKU have visible white matter abnormalities. Now, a couple of nuances with that. One is we have to think about what we call the cohort effect. So our expectations and our abilities now to keep Phe levels lower with some of the new tools and approaches that are out there is much better nowadays than it was, even 5-10 years ago. And so many of these individuals that were included in the study would have Phe levels that we would say are above what we kind of target nowadays. Just to show you this, though, this is some data actually from our lab. On the left here, you have an MRI of a typical 30-year-old without PKU. And this is a slight, you're going to say, like, well, it looks like a different MRI. It is. It's a different kind of MRI. This is called a T2 image. So it's really almost an inversion. right? So if you look at it, that gray matter on the surface is actually light colored. The white matter in the middle is dark colored. And those ventricles, which are full of those CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, are bright white, right? So they're right here. And on the right, you've got a 30-year-old with PKU. In this case, I want to say that this person, her recent Phe levels were around 700, which 700 micromoles per liter, which if you deal in micrograms per deciliter, that would be about 11 or 12, right? So she had a history of Phe levels above what we would at least target in the States for Phe levels. And what you can see on her MRI is if you look closely, see these bright white spots that are outside the ventricles here and here? That represents damage to the white matter. And we call these, it's fancy name for them is white matter hyperintensities, but hyperintensities just mean that they're bright white. But this is very typical of what we would see with somebody with elevated Phe levels. Now, what we know about these Phe, about the white matter damage that we see when we do see it, is that it tends to be correlated with two things. One is as individuals get older, we tend to see more of this, but also as elevated Phe levels are, as Phe levels are more elevated, they also tend to be much more pronounced, regardless of age. And with this, some of the recent work and this that we've been doing in our lab is to better characterize, better understand the progression and the nature of these white matter abnormalities. Just to give you again some context, past studies, what they would do often is you'd take this type of MRI that you're seeing here, somebody would look at it and say 1 to 5, how bad is it? And that was it. Like it didn't matter about where it was in the brain or anything else. It was just somebody rating the MRIs. Well, we've moved well beyond that. So now what we can do is we used a more advanced MRI technique called diffusion tensor imaging. And this allows us to look at the microstructural integrity of the white matter. So what's going on at almost a cellular level. In addition, instead of looking at the brain as a whole, we actually acknowledge that there's organization of the brain. So I mentioned that we've got all these wires flowing throughout the brain. You think of it kind of as a highway system, right? There's an organization, a plan to it. And so what we're able to do is say like, well, we're not interested in looking at the whole brain. We're going to break that apart and look at specific, we call them tracks or pathways, specific tracks in the brain what the integrity of those tracks looks like, right? And the last part with that looking at tracks is we're not even looking at the whole track. We can look at the health of that track along its whole progression, right? And so with that, I just want to show you and kind of share with you some examples of some of the recent research we've doing. We're using these techniques. So in this case, one of the tracks are these pathways or highways, however you want to think of them, that we're looking at the brain. It's called the left superior longitudinal fasciculus. So this is it's pictured here on the left. It's a very pronounced tract in the brain. You can see how long it runs all the way from the most anterior parts of the brain, so we call it prefrontal cortex, to the posterior parts. On the left side, it's very critical for language comprehension and production, and as well as other abilities. And so what we're able to do is we can look at the health of this pathway all the way from, I said, the very first front part to the back part. And the coloring here just helps you represent what it looks like on the graph over here. So the purple represents this part of the graph, and the red is over here. So you can see this is the whole extent of that pathway. Now on the y-axis here, we have, you can think of this as the health of that pathway. The actual name of the measure is what we call mean diffusivity. Don't get too bogged down in that detail. But in general, higher means better. Also the units here, again, completely arbitrary. Just know that higher means better. In this study, we gathered data from a group of individuals without PKU, and you can see that data here in the blue line. Next, we gathered data from a group of individuals, of course, with PKU. And to illustrate the impact of Phe levels on the data, what I've done is I've taken that whole group of patients with PKU and we divided it right down the middle. So made it two groups, one based on recent Phe levels. So the group with higher Phe levels had Phe levels that were above 11 or 12 micrograms per deciliter. The lower group, it was lower than 11 or 12 micrograms per deciliter. So again, even our lower group was slightly elevated relative to our target in the States, which is 6 micrograms per deciliter or 360 micromoles per liter. But just so you know, high and low Phe. So we looked at our lower Phe group, here's what we saw was that the anterior, so the very front parts of that path were completely healthy, but the posterior parts, the more back parts towards the back of the brain, were negatively impacted. Right now, here's what we saw in our higher Phe patients. So not only do we still have the posterior parts of the brain being impacted, but now it's much worse, and that damage has now extended to the anterior front parts of the track as well. All right. So, and this is kind of consistent with what we see with these white matter abnormalities, is that when we first see them, they tend to be towards the back of the brain. And as they increase in severity, they go more anterior. So with that, you know, the upside and the part I really want you to take home is that we know that the degree and the risk, the phenylalanine level, so metabolic, sorry, let me get a drink. So our Phe levels completely moderate the impact and severity of these white matter abnormalities. Right. So past and current treatment. And we've known that for a while. And I bring this out because this is data I'm going to show you and walk you through here from Cleary and colleagues. So this is from almost 30 years ago. And what Cleary and colleagues did is they had a group of individuals who had been off diet, right? And were returning to diet. We're going to return to diet. And so what they did was before they returned to diet, they said, okay, hey, we're going to do MRIs. And they did. And they did the exact same kind of MRIs I was showing you. Of course, this is 30 years ago. So the imaging, the resolution, all that's a little bit fuzzier. But you could see here on the left, this is an MRI from one of their patients before they did the study. We could still see this kind of white matter abnormalities, hyperintensities back here near the posterior ventricles, right? Then what they did is they had all the individuals in the study went on 3 months of strict dietary treatment. So they brought those Phe levels way down, below. Oh, I got to remember I don't remember the exact amounts they had, but let's say below 6 micrograms per deciliter. And then after 3 months, they re-scanned these individuals. And pretty much across the board, almost every participant showed improvements in this white matter. And indeed, the data I'm showing you here on the right, this is the MRI for the same person as on the left. I mean, you don't have to be a neuroradiologist to see how much better this is. I do point out a couple caveats. One is, well, only just one caveat, is that no one, excuse me, as I said, almost all the participants showed improvement. None of them, though, in none of them did the white matter abnormalities go completely away. Now, we don't know why that is. It could be because, these folks have been off diet for a while, had been off treatment for a while. And so the fact that they were able to reverse a lot of this damage this quickly is amazing. But if you've got 5 years worth of damage, the idea that it's going to all go away in 3 months might be a little optimistic. What unfortunately didn't happen is I would love to have seen these folks left on that strict treatment, and then scan them, of course, at 6 months or a year. And it's very possible that it could have all resolved. We just don't know in that case. I'll also point out, so we more recently have effectively replicated this using our more advanced techniques. In this case, we had a group of patients that were getting ready to take sapropterin. And so we scanned those individuals before they were getting ready. And then we came back and rescanned those folks that showed a 20% or greater drop in Phe levels. So, again, whereas with the Cleary study, those folks probably showed like a 200-300% drop in Phe, we're looking at simply 20% in response to sapropterin. I'm going to show you that data. So we had a non-PKU group, which you can see here. Our PKU group before they started treatment, or before that Phe level dropped, you can see here again, the same idea. We've got some lower values here in the posterior cortex, and also in this case it's anterior as well, but not as bad. Now, after 6 months, in this case, of having those Phe levels drop 20% or more, here's what we saw. So really promising, again, very consistent with Cleary saw. So the front parts of those tracks, which are the last ones, of course, to be affected, are the first ones to become healthy again. And even the more posterior aspects are getting better. So very promising. The thing again to take home is that, and this was all adult. Well, this was mostly adults actually, but Cleary's study I think was all adults. Even in adults, if we're able to bring those Phe levels down, we could see improvements in recovery from the white matter issues. So really exciting. I will stop there real quick to see if there's any questions on any of this.
I have a question. I figured if I stand in front of you, you can hear me better.
If I do this, I don't know if it helps, but I'm going to put my ear up to the computer. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was wondering the before and after pictures you just showed us of the person with PKU. Did you take a blood level? Did you test their levels to see the difference between the before level and the after level, and then take the pictures? Was that part of the study?
Oh, you mean this study, what you're looking at right now?
The other one, the one before.
This one.
So this is a person with PKU?
Yes. So this wasn't our research. This was Cleary and colleagues from 30 years ago.
So I was just wondering if you knew what the levels were for the before and then the levels were after.
That is a great question. I don't have that handy this moment, but give me 30 seconds. The beauty of being on a computer is I could search real quick to see if I have that handy. Oh, shoot. Let's see here. Oh, where would it be? We just search because it's a great question. I want to say they were very high before because these folks were completely off diet. A lot of these individuals were folks that were put on diet when they were born, but then they were told after the age of like 6 or 6 years, like, oh, well, you're good, fine, just go eat a regular diet, or even 12.
Great. Okay, no rush.
I apologize. I'm not seeing that. I really need to add that to my notes. I knew it at one time. Let's put it that way. But yeah, I mean, my recall of this is that, some of these folks were 20 micrograms per deciliter or higher easily.
Okay.
And they're brought down below 10, if I recall.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? I figure if we stand in front of him, because the speaker's here, right? So.
Yeah, I could hear you perfectly. That was a great approach. All right. Now, as I mentioned, the vast majority of the work has been focused on white matter. So one of the things that we've been doing of late in our lab is really saying, like, well, let's look at the gray matter, because the white matter and the gray matter, they're necessarily parts of the same neural structures and neurons, and so things affecting the white matter may very well affect gray matter as well. And so again, that's been a focus of something we've done. A few years ago, we looked at the thickness of that layer of gray matter on the surface of the brain, if you remember me showing you that. And what we found was there were a number of different brain regions where we saw consistent thinning in the group of individuals, again, adults with PKU. And you can see these regions, they're all kind of different colors on the screen. The colors themselves don't represent anything, big or smaller. It's just denoting different brain regions. But the big part here is that a lot of the regions we saw were in the posterior cortex, so towards the back of the brain. This is really consistent, again, with what we see with the white matter. So if you remember, I said that the white matter, when we start to see the changes in the white matter, they start in the posterior cortex and then go more anterior towards the front. And so it's not really surprising so much that we see changes in gray matter. They tend to be towards the back of the brain. So we did this a few years ago. What we're focusing on now, our most recent work, is looking at what we call subcortical brain regions. So these are regions towards the middle of the brain. They're evolutionarily older parts of the brain, but still very important. One of these regions that I'm going to highlight and I want to kind of share with you is we call the basal ganglia. So it's shown here in green. It's actually, we call it one structure because we call it the basal ganglia, but it's actually made up of several smaller structures that are so interconnected that, again, it just makes sense to think of them as one structure. But what we know is from the historical kind of research is that the basal ganglia plays a very important role in motor control and motor learning. In that sense, my video of my son, this is my son, using failing, but using his basal ganglia in this case when he's learning to ride his bike. And so as you can see, I really, every time I watch this, I get anxious because he's a couple years older now and getting closer. He still has 5 years to go before he gets his license. But I'm like, oh my God, I just hope he's really trying to hit those cones, because if not, him driving is going to be a challenge. But anyway, this just illustrates that the idea that the basal ganglia is a very important structure when it comes to motor control and motor learning. And we looked at the basal ganglia. One of those substructures that we really focused in on is called the putamen. And the reason we focus in on the putamen is because it has a high percentage of dopaminergic neurons, so neurons that rely on and utilize dopamine. And again, if you remember how we started today talking, dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters that we kind of worry about. What's interesting is when we looked at the putamen, we actually saw that it was significantly larger in the PKU sample than the non-PKU sample. And just again, to kind of orient you here, our PKU data, our PKU groups are in the red, and the non-PKU is in the blue. So you can see it's bigger, right? It was significantly bigger in a PKU group. First thought is like, sweet, awesome, bigger is better. Well, what I would say is that when it comes to the brain, we have kind of what we call a Goldilocks phenomenon. So too big or maybe too small may not be a good thing. In this case, what we're thinking is happening here is it's not that with higher Phe levels that we're seeing an actual growth of putamen, like new neurons. It's more that those neurons that are present in the putamen, as we talked about, as Phe levels go up, you get all that competition. The dopamine levels are going to go down, and so you've got neurons that are basically starved for dopamine, and so they're spreading out their dendritic arborizations, so kind of their roots, if you will, to try and find more and more dopamine, and that's leading to these neurons taking up more space in an overall enlargement in the putamen. Consistent with that thought, if we look at the relationship between recent Phe levels and putamen volume, what we see is that as Phe levels go up, the extent or magnitude of this enlargement gets even bigger, right? So the folks with the highest Phe levels were also the ones with the biggest putamen. We haven't looked at, I should also allude to, I don't have a slide on this, but we also looked at this as it related to motor control and motor learning. What we found was as Phe levels went up, putamen volumes got bigger, and people's performance on tests of motor control and motor learning got poorer, right? So again, the kind of consistent with this idea that this enlargement may not be necessarily a good thing. What we haven't done yet, and no one's done, is look at whether the putamen volume will change with treatment in much the same way we see that white matter does. My expectation is that it will, and it does. We just don't have the data to look at this. But I would expect that it would. So that's just kind of a taste, if you will, of some of the gray matter studies that we're doing. Again, I'm happy to answer questions when we get a little farther along, if folks have any questions about something they've seen in the literature. But this is just some of the more recent stuff that we've been doing. All right. What I'd like to do is spend the rest of our time talking about the research that our lab and others are doing on cognitive behavioral presentation. So again, that's kind of what we see on the brain. So how does that manifest, or how does that affect potentially cognition and behavior? So one of the things that we focus on most recently is cognitive abilities and cognitive performance in adults with PKU. So there is a fair amount of literature out there on the effects of elevated Phe on abilities in children. But there's not a lot that we know about cognitive function in adults with PKU. Part of this is when I talk to the communities, the PKU community and individuals, one of the biggest things that people tend to be anxious about and worried about is, what does it mean to grow older with PKU? So much of the focus is on kids, and that's okay, but kids turn into adults who turn into older adults, and we don't know. And so this research, already laid out, is that we did go up to, I think, 35 years of age on this research. But our hope is to expand this and go, of course, look at individuals that are actually much older than that as well. So again, the idea of this study that I'm going to show you is we wanted to look at cognitive abilities in adults with PKU. The other thing that we're constantly doing in our lab is looking at asking ourselves, what's the best way to measure, right? So what's the best way to measure white matter? What's the best way to measure gray matter? In this case, what's the best way to measure cognition? Many of these studies that we have out there, are being utilizing tests and approaches that have been around for 30 years, which is great. But the advancements we have recently in technology give us incredible tools and opportunity to get better. How do we do it better? And so with that, we also, as part of the study, we're piloting a relatively new or novel method for cognitive assessment. And this is called the NIH Toolbox. Kind of as the name suggests, the National Institutes of Health, which is the major research funding entity of our government in the States, supported the development of this toolbox. And when they developed this toolbox, this new measure, they had a couple goals. One is they wanted something that was very engaging, right? That wasn't boring, that was interactive, that participants that were receiving it would enjoy exactly at the same time that they're getting assessed. The other part was they wanted a measure that could be used for longitudinal studies, so to follow folks across time and not do it just in PKU, but something that would be broadly helpful to the research community. And so with that, the toolbox has been validated for folks from 3 years of age all the way up to 80. So you can use the same test for everybody. That engaging part, it's done on an iPad, as this picture suggests. If we look at the stimuli are colorful, they're engaging. I won't go, because of time, I won't go through all the tasks, but I will say is that another aspect of the toolbox that's really unique is that instead of doing the same task for like 30 minutes, it's actually, you do different tasks every 5 to 7 minutes. So you might do a 5 to 7 minute task that gets a processing speed, another one that gets at what we call executive function, so these higher order abilities, working memory, inhibitory control, strategy use, cognitive flexibility. So each of those, you're kind of getting a taste and a flavor for each of those abilities. And you look up after 30 minutes and you now have a nice broad measure of folks' abilities across all these different abilities, their performance across these different abilities. For example, I mentioned processing speed. The test here, this bottom left-hand corner, this is the test for processing speed. You're just showing 2 pictures, and as quick as you can, yes, no, are they the same? So real easy, but the idea is how quick can you respond? So how speeded, how quick can you respond and process information? And so with that, we incorporated this toolbox into our research. In this study, we had 40 adults with PKU. In this case, we went up to 36 years of age. As I mentioned, the work that we're planning for the future, we want to go much older than that. This is kind of a good place to start. You'll notice our Phe levels. There's a wide variety of Phe levels. Again, I don't know if you're familiar with micromoles per liter or micrograms per deciliter. If you're familiar with micrograms per deciliter, this is, a 1 all the way up to a 30, right? So a huge range of Phe levels among our participants, but that was on purpose, because what we really want to know is we want to know, how does Phe levels impact cognition? And now when we look at it, if I'll show you the data here, the first couple things we looked at was full-scale IQ. So think of this as overall cognitive abilities. In this case, higher is better. All right. What we saw was the PKU group performed just a few points below the non-PKU group. Nothing significant, not statistically significant, consistent, but we saw just a slight difference. Now, when we looked at verbal ability, there was absolutely no difference between the groups. And I should mention, when I say verbal ability, I'm talking about kind of dictionary knowledge of words. So what does it mean to transform? What's a panacea? Who is Marie Curie? So just kind of verbal knowledge and verbal ability. Absolutely no difference. The next thing we did is I turned our attention to some other abilities that we know from the literature in children we worry about. And those include what we call executive function. So if you're not familiar with executive function, this refers to these higher order abilities. So strategy use, planning, organization, we call inhibitory control, working memory. So the ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it before responding. We saw that the group of patients, individuals with PKU, performed consistently below those without PKU in this group, in this ability. And again, consistent with what we worry about for kids. Also processing speed. So we mentioned processing speed earlier. I've had people ask me, like, give me an example of processing speed. What I can give you is an example of what it's like to have problems with processing speed. So if you've ever listened to an audiobook on your phone and accidentally jacked up the speed to like 2 or 3 times regular, right, and tried to listen to it, it's super hard, right, because the words are coming out really fast and it's really like this and all. I mean, if you focus really hard, you can pull content, but the minute you're distracted, so squirrel, that you lose track of the conversation, you lose track of the information. That's what it can be like for individuals that have problems with processing speed or have difficulties with processing speed, is that even though the information is coming in at a typical rate, they're not able to keep up with it, not without exerting an incredible amount of focus. And so again, something we worry about, particularly with elevated PHE. And last one was motor skills. And so we saw that the folks with PKU perform slightly below or below those without PKU. Now, those are the group differences. But as I mentioned earlier, is we're not as interested in the group differences. What we want to know is, so yeah, our PKU group here is not performing as well, but how much of that is related to metabolic control? How much of that is really about PHE? Well, it turns out most of it's about PHE in this case. This shows you, it's a scatter plot, so you see every single data point in here, and the relationship between score, so higher is better, and PHE levels. And I'm like, you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a researcher to see this relationship here. Those folks with higher PHE levels perform more poorly. For those that are kind of statistics geeks like myself, the Pearson correlation was 0.64. That means that 1/3 of the variance, so 1/3 of the variability in performance was explained by PHE levels. That's a tremendous amount. This data is for the executive function, but I'll tell you that the data for processing speed and also processing speed and motor skills looks just the same. It's that as PHE levels went up, performance went down. So that's that's some of the recent data. I'll stop there for a moment and see if there's any questions on that study. Okay, so I'll keep going. Again, if somebody's making their way to the front, just keep going to the front and it's all good. So as we just kind of showed you and talked about, is that with elevated PHE, we worry about specific types of cognition or cognitive areas. Those, of course, include executive function, processing speed. One thing we didn't talk about and didn't show was sustained attention. What we know from the literature is that in individuals, there's a higher rate of ADHD among individuals with PKU versus those that don't have PKU. That doesn't mean that everybody with PKU has ADHD. It just means if we look at the numbers, the rate of ADHD is higher in the PKU community. The type of ADHD it tends to be is the inattentive type. But again, that doesn't mean that there's not individuals with PKU that have hyperactive impulsivity to go with ADHD. It's just, again, giving you the data. Also, visual spatial ability, something that we've got some recent research suggesting that may be something we worry about as PHE goes up, and then we've talked about fine motor control. We know this from the literature. Of course, the study we just did, other studies, really kind of this fits this. And there's also an increased awareness, which appreciate among the community, among the scientific and clinical community about these difficulties or potential difficulties of elevated PHE. Something, though, that we often forget about, or I want to say, don't give the same amount of focus to, but we should, is the fact that individuals with PKU can also be an increased risk for anxiety and depression. We worry, I feel like, so much about the cognition that we're forgetting or not paying attention to the psychological part. And to show you some data on this, so this is a study from 1997. So 25 years ago, we knew this. And this was by Peets and colleagues. And what they did is they had a group of individuals with PKU, and they just asked them about symptoms of depression and anxiety. And they also had a comparison group. And what they found is that those individuals with PKU were reporting things like depression, anxiety, phobias at twice the rate of individuals without PKU. One of the things that's not on here is what we call agoraphobia. So that's a fear of leaving home. That was about 2 to 3 times greater in this group of individuals with PKU as compared to those without PKU. So, this is real. More recently, that as part of that NIH toolbox study I just showed you, we also included a measure of anxiety and depression. In this case, it's a combined measure. And we looked at the relationship to PHE. And so here on the y-axis, this is the symptom score. In this case, higher is worse. So a higher score means the person is reporting more symptoms. And as you can see here, this relationship with PHE, so those folks with higher PHE tended to report higher symptom scores. What I will kind of caveat all this by saying is that it's in the case of anxiety and depression, it's not all about the PHE. So what we know is that even individuals that have PHE levels that are well within kind of the target treatment range, there can still be an increased risk of anxiety and depression. And we attribute this to what we call a chronic stress model. And that's the idea that, having PKU and managing PKU is stressful. It can be stressful. And so with that stress comes a susceptibility to anxiety and depression. So even if you're keeping your PHE levels low, the stress of doing that can make you susceptible to anxiety and depression. Regardless of what your PHE levels are, we still worry about this. Now, it is true also, though, that the higher those PHE levels get, we increase that risk even more. But I always like to point out that in this case, we worry about everybody, and we want to check in and make sure everybody's doing okay, regardless of PHE levels. Now, with that, again, research in our lab for up until the last few years, actually up until about COVID, so until 2020, has really focused almost exclusively on the brain and cognition. It was right around COVID when we kind of had an epiphany as a lab and read some papers and really got interested in this issue of anxiety and depression, and really saw it as an unmet need or undermet need or awareness. And so what we've set out to do is really figure out and try and figure out, like, okay, what's the best way to measure? How do we best capture anxiety and depression symptoms that are being experienced by individuals with PKU? And so with this, we started doing research on what we call in-the-moment assessment of anxiety and depression. So for those that have ever done a questionnaire on anxiety or depression, or had an assessment of anxiety and depression, of course, we know that in most cases, right, what happens? You're given a questionnaire, you fill it out, and it says, oh, how anxious have you been in the last, think about the last month. How anxious have you been? Or how many times have you experienced that? And that's tough, right? Because we all are bad with our recall. Well, I guess I'm bad at our recall, but many of us are, it's difficult to recall that, right? What the literature suggests, and the kind of the general literature research, is that if we can ask you in the moment, though, like we ask, okay, right now, how are you experiencing? People are so much better at accurately responding to that. And so this is what we set out to do, is we're using now a cell phone based application. So it's installed on your cell phone, and we're asking people in the moment, how do you feel right now? Like, how depressed are you? And we're not just saying like, how depressed are you? It's also symptoms like, are you feeling skittish? Are you, how are you worried? Are you feeling down, tired, things like that we associate with depression or anxiety. And as I alluded to, this kind of approach overcomes many of the limitations associated with that traditional methods, which are kind of the questionnaire that we ask people about all the time. So the way we're doing this is with this app, people are prompted 4 times a day for 7 consecutive days. It sounds like a lot, but they're just answering about 10 questions, 10 to 15 questions on, like, how anxious are you at this moment? And they're prompted randomly within 4 hours, 3 hours. So sometime between 9 and 12, sometime in the morning between 9 and 12, they've randomly pick a time. You're asked, it dings at you and says, hey, I've got a question for you. 12 to 3 in the afternoon, 3 to 6, and 6 to 9 in the evenings. We do want to get in the moment, right? So we give people about 15 minutes to respond because, if you're driving or, you're on the phone or something else, we want to give people time to get to a place where it's safe, where they're able to, to respond without, crashing or anything like that. And of course, people have the option if it's a student, they're in class, we don't want them responding at all. And so what this looks like, if you guys could, I don't know if you can see on that screen, but it just pops up the screen and says something like, I feel anxious. And then they pick 1 to 5, like not at all, very much. And it's all about in that moment. So it takes about 20 seconds at most to do this. Very easy. But we get a lot of data, right? So and it's in the moment. Now, just to kind of give you an example of the study design, this kind of gives you an idea. On the y-axis here, you see time of day. So 9 a.m., 1 p.m., 3 p.m., and so on. In the days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see here this first time period, which is in orange. On day 1, it prompted them at about 9:15. The next day it was like 10:50, and then down here 9:30, and so on. So it's kind of random, but there's always at least one time point each day during this period. Next 3 hours, same way and same way and same way. Now, importantly for the study, one of the things we did is on day 8, we came back and said, hey, now I want you to think about the past 7 days and tell me about, on average, like how anxious you were. And we go back through all the same symptoms. So again, in this case, this is very similar to what we traditionally do, right? We get a questionnaire that says, think about the last 7 days, think about the last 14 days. And the reason we do that is we want to compare what's better, right? The in the moment measures or that retrospective measure. Because if the retrospective measure is okay, then we don't need to hassle people throughout the day. We can just stick with our questionnaires. So, we've done this, and this is an ongoing study. Just I say hot off the presses, but this hasn't even hit the presses yet. So you guys are seeing like a glimpse of this data. So far, we've had 28 individuals with PKU, 28 without PKU participate. The average age is 30 on both of these. Phe levels are 572, so that's about a 10 micrograms per deciliter. Now, we look at this data, and there's a lot of stuff here, so I'm going to walk you through this. On our y-axis anxiety score, so higher is worse in the case, so it means more anxiety. The blue in this case is the non-PKU, and the green is the PKU. I apologize for the color changes. I pulled this in from a different presentation just for you guys. Like I said, it's hot off the presses. But the green in this case is our PKU group. Blue is our non-PKU, and it's broken down by females and males, right? So first thing we look at is that 7-day retrospective report. It seems to be that there's elevated anxiety in the PKU group, but it was not statistically significant. There was too much variability in individuals. However, if we look at that in the moment score, so what they're experiencing in the moment and reporting in the moment, we see that the PKU group is significantly higher, and that was consistent, right? So it was there. We were able to detect it reliably with this measure. So just comparing the old approach and new approach speaks to the fact that this new approach is more sensitive. We're able to actually pick up on things and see it consistently. We did go in a little bit to say, like, well, what's driving this? Is it, the minimum scores? No, there's no real differences. Maximum scores, it does seem that there might be moments in particular where the individuals with PKU are experiencing, maximum of your really acute anxiety, but mostly in the average. If we look at the depression scores, much the same story. So I won't spend a whole time on this, but in short, when we looked at the in the moment, approach, it was able to detect and consistently detect differences between the PKU and not PKU group in depression as well that weren't necessarily evident on the retrospective measure. So what was curious, and we broke this out, is we also were wondering, like, well, does the day of the week matter? Right. So we said 7 days. And that's one of the reasons we do 7 days, is because we did 7 days and not 3 days, is because if I ask you for 3 days and your 3 days were Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I can imagine that would be different than somebody else we asked who did Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So we were like, hey, we're going to get every day of the week from everybody. And we did that, and we broke it down just to kind of orient you to this. Again, apologies for the different colors. The blue and the green down here now, these are depression and anxiety scores for our non-PKU group. These two lines up here are the scores or the reports for those folks with PKU. What we see is, you see that difference in the two groups, which we just saw in the averages across the board. But look at what happens on Friday. All of a sudden, something about Friday, our individuals with PKU they dip across the board. They dip in terms of their anxiety and depression, and they kind of carry that into Saturday a little bit. And so looking forward, I mean, one of the things we would really want to better understand is what's going on with this dip, because we don't see it. If you look here, you really don't see it in your controls, your non-PKU, right? But it's really that PKU group that's saying, like, hey, Friday and Saturday are good days. So I will stop there. Well, let me get through the preliminary conclusions, and then I'll stop. Is that what we found? And again, this is we're still doing this. It's a 2-year project. We've got through 1 year. We're actually going to start very, very soon in recruiting for year 2 participants. And I kind of put out, if anyone's interested in being a part of this, please reach out to our lab. We can. Because it's cell phone based, you don't have to come in person to Missouri, although Missouri is beautiful. We can do it via, Zoom and phone and things like that. So reach out, and I'll have my contact information here at the end of this. But anyway, the cell phone based, we call it ecological momentary assessment. That's what EMA means. But it was easy to use, and it was well tolerated. So people were like, yeah, it's not a big deal. Like, I'm on my phone all day anyway. They loved it. They said it was really easy. And as we kind of showed you data, is that in the moment reports are more sensitive than the typical retrospective report that we all do on paper and pencil. And looking forward, we're going to take this approach, and you're probably already thinking, if you're like me, like, what else can we do on the cell phone apps? We can ask about neurocognitive symptoms, right? So brain fog, attentional difficulties. We're going to start asking about that. The other part that we're going to ask about is sleep quality. And I'll get back to that here in a moment, and fatigue. So let me stop there. I know that was a lot. Are there any questions on the cell phone based work that we're doing? No. Oh, hi.
Yeah, sorry. The question is that if you were to want to be in this study, do your levels have to be a certain rate, at a certain rate right now?
They do not. So one of the things that we're looking for that's a great question. We do try and we call stratify our studies, because of course, we want to be able to take our study results and generalize them to everybody with PKU, right? So if we had a study, and let's say everybody in the study was on peg-valiase, or we call it Palynziq, and so everybody had like levels of 1, right? Well, that doesn't tell us about all the people that aren't taking it, right? On the flip, if we had a bunch of people that were running, 20s or 15s, and that was everybody in our study, we can't generalize the people that have lower Phe levels. So what we do is we stratify. We try and get as many males as females as we can. We also try and get people, as many number of people that are 6 micrograms per deciliter and below, as we do 6 to 10 and above 10. That just generally, and then we go from there. But it's open to everybody. What I would say too is reach out to our lab. You know, if there's not room in this study, for example, for you, we're constantly doing so many other studies, and I'll just say is that I'd love to tell you, I wish we had more time because this is just one of the studies we're doing. We're doing another one where we're developing a new measure, a patient-reported outcome measure of cognitive symptoms, because we feel like that needs to be out there. We're doing another study with adolescents with anxiety and depression, where we're developing a telehealth intervention that can be done via, you know, this telehealth via Zoom, right, from wherever you are, to help kids with anxiety and depression. What else are we doing? Yeah, we've got so many studies we're constantly doing. Is that even if we fill up one study, we have all these other opportunities that we're always happy to share with folks. But that's a great question. And we love our engagement and involvement of the PKU community. I mean, I feel like the relationship between our lab and the PKU community is very, it's Saturday, so I'm missing the big word, but you know, we can't do it without you. In short, it's you know, we love working with the community, but we're also recognize is that, you know, we couldn't accomplish what we're doing without engagement and the help of the PKU community. So looking forward, I mentioned this, and this is what I want to bring. So one of the things I put on here was sleep quality, right? And people might be like, why sleep? Other people are like, yeah, totally. It turns out that sleep is one of the new things. You asked me, like, what do we need to look at? And I think, you know, from a researcher standpoint and talking to people from the PKU community, I get a feeling there's two things that we really need to look at. We really want to start focusing on. One is, as I mentioned, what does it mean to grow older with PKU? The other one is sleep. It turns out there's been a handful of studies, and none really great studies, but the best study that was done on sleep in PKU is this one by Bruenberg and colleagues. And what they did was they looked at the number of individuals in their sample that met criteria for sleep disorder. And so when they looked at their group without PKU, they found that about 20%, so 19% of individuals without PKU met criteria for sleep disorder, sleep problems. That's what we see in the general population. It's very consistent with that. When they looked at their sample of individuals with PKU, it was nearly half of individuals met criteria for sleep. And when they looked at it further, because you can have different types of sleep disorders, you can have sleep apnea, you can have night terrors. In this case, it was primarily difficulties with insomnia, so difficulties falling asleep or staying asleep. I will tell you is that this is the other study that we're starting to do. We're starting to do some sleep research, and what we're finding is very consistent with this. In my mind, it just blows my mind because it brings up so many possibilities. If you're not sleeping well, whether you have PKU or not, if you're not sleeping well, we're worried about cognition. We're worried about anxiety and depression. And so it makes me wonder how much is sleep moderating the effects of on cognition and anxiety and depression that we're seeing and we're worried about. And so I think this is somewhere that we as a community really need to focus and better understand is, you know, what's going on with sleep. The good thing is if folks are having problems with sleep, there are a number of tried and true and empirically supported treatments, some pharmacological, but other ones that are psychotherapy based that really can help people with sleep. And so I think this is an opportunity for folks to feel better and have better quality of life. So overall, this is the last slide I have. If what we've talked about today, and I've had fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well, is that what we know is that elevated PHE is associated with compromised white matter and gray matter in the brain. So as PHE goes up, we worry about white and gray matter. As PHE goes up, we also worry about difficulties in particular areas of cognition. So things like executive control, our executive function, processing speed, attention. As PHE goes up, we worry about these. Also, we talked about increased risk for anxiety and depression. The good news is, though, is that the evidence is out there that many of these effects are reversible to some degree with improved metabolic control. So, I always say we can't change things that have already happened, but looking forward, if we're able to bring Phe levels down lower, we can see improvements in these, whether we're talking children or adults with PKU. It is an exciting time, I think, in the PKU community. We've had some new treatment options that have recently become available. There's also a number of new treatments and options that are on the cusp. So they're in like phase 3 clinical trials that have a lot of promise. And I think the ultimate goal in my mind is that we have all these tools, and one tool isn't going to work for everybody necessarily, but having all those tools, it's a way to find out what works best for you and what your lifestyle and your approach. So whatever we can do to help lower Phe. So that's all I have. I just want to say thank you for taking the time. This is a picture of my lab, my team. I'm the one that gets to stand up here and, well, not stand. I guess I'm sitting today, but I get to sit and share this exciting results with you. But it really is a team that I couldn't do it without. And then our funders and sponsors. So National Institutes of Health, National PKU Alliance here in the States, and BioMarin is pharmaceutical, of course. They've supported some of our past research as well. And I'll put this up as that, again, if you're interested in volunteering, please reach out to our lab. We'd love to have you participate, or at least tell you about some of our research and see if you're interested. So I will stop talking now and let you talk and see what questions you may have.
I love training work. I've come up with this poster to read about it. Just because, sorry. Okay, I know. But just so you know, any of the adults with PKU, because that's the study he's doing, in your buckets is the front of the overview, and the back is how to contact him as well. So it is in your buckets if you're an adult. If you're not an adult and you're like, hey, I just want information on that, I'm happy to send it to you for future use. But we're going to open for questions.
Yeah. Going back to that slide you had where it showed the dip on a Friday.
Yeah, let me pull that back up. And I'll also, before I forget, I'll mention is that I know all the data I showed you today is with adults, but we also work with children and younger families. I just focused on adults for today. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that. Are you guys going to look into that further on why there is such a big dip?
We are. Part of it too is these measures have a floor. So I think I don't have a great picture of it, but the folks are saying 1 to 5, like where a 1 is a not at all, right? And a 5 is, yeah, really all the time on. And as I mentioned, there's about 7 or 8 items of anxiety, 7 or 8 anxiety items, or 7 or 8 depression items. So on both of these scales, a 7 or 8 is kind of at the floor, like that there's not much symptoms at all. So part of this might be that everybody those folks that are in our comparison group, they're already responding almost as low as they can on these. Not quite. I mean, a 7, this is a 9, so you could get down to a 7, so they still have 2 points they can go lower. But those folks with PKU, they're much higher, so they have room to feel better on Friday, or to indicate better. That doesn't really answer why Friday and Saturday is better, but yeah, it's a great question. We were surprised to see this, and so as I mentioned, this is a 2-year project. So the data I'm showing you right now is from year 1. Year 2, we're getting ready to start. Within about the next month. Our goal is April 1st to start actually enrollment. And it's going to be one of those things that we're going to ask folks about, like, anecdotally. So after they get done, right? So you participate and then you're done. And then we call you afterwards and say, like, hey, what was your experience? Was Friday and Saturday, were there actually, probably just say, were any days of the week like less stressful than others? And then why? And so that way we're not spoiling our data, right? So if we ask them up front, then they might be like, oh, why are they asking me about Fridays or Saturdays? I'd rather do it after we get the data to then say, like, what do you think? And then see how their verbal kind of description of differences in the days, match up with what they were doing in the moment, and go from there. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, because you think if it was just the weekend, having that time off, maybe the week's a little more busy schedule, school and work, you would expect that it would kind of be flatline between Friday to maybe Sunday, but it starts to spike up on Saturday.
Right. And you know, and I go back and I say that, like, I cannot tell you how much you guys are seeing this hot off the presses. And so we've pulled this data, but we can go in and mine it. So the beauty of it is I can go into Saturday and say, like, let's look at Saturday morning versus Saturday evening. Right. So, and we just haven't had the chance. I say the great thing about this kind of approach is there's a lot of data. The challenging part is there's a lot of data, right? So for every participant, we have 28 data points. And then you multiply that by 60 people, and it's a lot of data to kind of go through.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Great question.
Anybody else? Okay, Connor?
I just want to quickly say thank you to you and your team for everything you do, first of all. And I got a question about the sleep quality. I've got an 8-year-old daughter who I think she eats mostly kind of at night and not a lot during the day. So I wondered if that would maybe spike her levels a bit. And that's kind of a reason for waking up throughout the night. And I guess maybe grasping at straws to kind of figure out why, but.
No, let me just say is that I think the best questions I get are ones that I say I don't know to. And I mean that in an honest fashion, is that the work that we're doing now is because of interactions and conversations like this, where somebody's asked us about anxiety or asked about depression. And I said, I don't know. And then we go back to our research team and we're like, nobody knows. Like, let's figure this out. And I think you're hitting on one of the things that we need to tease apart when we start to understand sleep is how does eating behaviors feed into that? That I made a pun and I didn't mean to. How do eating behaviors impact sleep patterns? We don't know yet. I was talking with Rhonda Connolly. She was one of the founders, if you will, of National PKU Alliance, and I was talking to her about the research that we're starting to do on sleep. And I mentioned about sleep problems. She's like, "Oh yeah, my sons," and she has 2 sons that are now out of the house and living on their own. Of course, they're older with PKU. She's like, "Oh yeah, my sons, whenever they would take their formula in the evenings, like they could not sleep very well at all." And I'm like, this is the kind of thing that we just don't understand yet. It's like, how does, eating behaviors, taking medical foods, how is that impacting sleep? I would say that, what you're describing with your daughter, I would bet it plays a role in that. We just don't, I can't confidently say how it does yet, but we are getting there. We're starting to do stuff. The other part that we're really excited about that I think is on the horizon is not only asking people about their sleep quality. So the stuff we're going to do immediately is every morning during this study, folks are going to get a quick questionnaire that says, like, oh, what time did you get into bed last night? What time did you start trying to fall asleep? What time were you actually successful at falling asleep? How good was your sleep? What time did you wake up? That's what we call a sleep diary. So they're going to do that every morning during this. What we eventually want to do is we want to tap into kind of like their Apple Watches or Fitbits or whatever to actually get, we call it a tigraphy data on objective sleep behavior to see, like, well, how much are they tossing and turning? When are they up? When are they down? I think that's going to give, you take that and you get a diet diary, if you will. Well, we could start to figure these things out. But sorry, this is a really long answer to a question, but it was a great question. And these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to answer going forward.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Just to kind of piggyback on that,
Yeah.
like I know when she was younger, we'd always try and get her to her whatever level she had to be at the end of the day. So we kind of hammer her with milk or whatever to get her to her number, right? So I wondered too if maybe that had some sort of effect.
Yeah. It's so tough. And, when we talk about treatment and diet and some of these other things, what I say to folks is we look at our data, we're all doing the best we can, is what I say. Is like everybody's doing the best they can. And at some point when it comes to things like fee levels, you have to take into consideration quality of life. We all do. And I'm not implying this about you or your daughter, but it makes me think of, I could show you that I could tell people that we look at white matter pathways, and in terms of white matter, a 4 is better than a 6, a 2 is better than a 4. But if it's making you completely miserable to maintain a 2 versus a 4, or a 4 versus a 6, you have to take quality of life into consideration. That's got to be part of what we're thinking. And what I'm excited about, again, is all these new treatment options that are coming out that are very soon on the horizon that will allow us, hopefully, to keep fee levels low and improve quality of life, because it's stressful. If it were easy to maintain low fee levels for everybody, then everybody would be doing it, right? It's just that it's a challenge for many people.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
And again, thank you for everything you and your team do. Appreciate
Sure.
it.
Thank you.
Anybody else with questions? Comments? Like I say, I'm always drawn to Dr. Shawn's posters because I hear from you guys all the time, there's not enough about adults. There's not enough about their teen coming into what they're going to go through. So I truly appreciate all the work your team does as well, because you're helping give some of those answers back to the community, and that's so important at this point, because it's true. Like, we know a lot about the littles because there's been a lot of work there already. But I think everyone in this room is with at least one child or themselves are moving out of the littles. And so having this it's a new scary time. So your information is fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. And I have a wonderful camp, and maybe one of these years I can actually come in person. Again, what I've looked up of where you are, it sounds incredibly beautiful.
It's very similar to what you put there. It looks like you have a river kind of happening in the back, maybe a little bit of a waterfall. That's because it's pouring rain today.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm so jealous. All right.
That's okay. Indoor session was good for right now.
Well, I'll let you guys go. Take care. And again, if anyone has any questions, I should have said this before, but if you have any follow-up questions or I could ever be of help, please email me. If you missed my email, it sounds like it's you guys got that. Google Missouri Christ PKU, and I'm the only one you're going to find. So take care. And yeah, thank you. Bye. Bye.
He's also said, I'm more than welcome to record this with Big Down and to distribute your posts as we see fit. So it will go onto our YouTube page. But I encourage you all to join because I put lots of stuff up there. So it's going to go on the YouTube page. You'll be able to watch it from there again.
It's gonna end.